Francis Greenway designed the place. He arrived in Australia 3 months after Emily Hovell did with her family. And this essentially was designed for Hovell's daughter and her husband William Bradley and his brother Thomas Bradley. The older brother died while this was being built in 1835. So William then went into partnership with a fellow called William Shelley. The brewery is only one part of an overall complex. It was a self-contained industrial site essentially. It was a steam-powered operation as well, which is the first steam-powered industrial site in this area. You can make malt out of any sort of cereal grain, but the best for making ales, which is what they made here, is barley grain. The horse would bring the grain in from Crookville, and they'd store all the barley up in above the maltings on the second level. So that was the granary essentially. You can only harvest it once a year, so you have to put it somewhere. There's a special little implement there called a plough, which is really an very ancient implement, shoveling along in front of her essentially. So she'd plough away through the grain, just a small path for her foot as she goes along, using the grain with a watering can in the other, keeping it moist and so on. And by the time then she gets the grain to the end of the room, well, a maltster is always a woman, and I suppose it was a woman's world really in terms of making the malt. She would then steep it in a cistern, or steep it's called, soak it in water overnight, and that starts the germination process going. She'd change the water during the night and several times to keep it fresh, skimming off any detritus and stuff from the top. After that initial steeping in the cistern or steep, she'd need to get in and shovel it out from there onto the floor and spread it out on the first section of the floor. The rest of the work then carried out on the floor. But she needs then to keep a close eye on all that, because as it germinates, it's growing essentially. She needs to keep control of the temperature. That's a crucial thing. The building is specially designed, it's a Greenway design, to keep control of the temperature, so there are shutters and louvers to open and close depending on what the weather's like, and also the temperature of the piece, as they call it, the bank of stuff that she's got there. She'd take samples of the grain in different parts of the room, rub them in the palm of her hand to rub the husk off, because the roots are actually growing under the husk, so you need to expose them. So she'd rub that off, and if it's getting too hot, the roots will start to wither. And if it's getting too cool, it won't germinate properly. So she gets an idea of what it's like with doing that. So if it's getting too hot, she'd thin the piece out to allow the heat to escape, because the grain generates heat of its own accord. And if it gets too hot, the roots will wither. So she'd open the shutters or close them up and so on, depending on how it's going. She'd gradually move it down along the floor. By the time she gets the first batch of grain down to the end of the room, she's got 7 batches all spread out along the floor. So each day, or at least the cistern, contains sufficient for a brew, which would then be spread on the floor, and that's one day. The following night she'd steep some more, and then have to move the first lot of grain down to make room for the next lot of grain to come out, and then move the whole lot further down and let the next lot of grain out, and so on, until gradually then she's got the whole of the floor covered in the germinating grain. So it takes her a week to get the first batch from there right down to the end of the room. But how does she manage to do all that without walking on it, so she doesn't bruise the grain, because they're very fussy about the quality of the grain they buy in the first place. If there's any bruising and so on, they'll reject the whole batch. But so in the process, you also need to have that care over the quality of the grain that you're using. So the wooden implements are designed to have that sort of less impact, if you like, on what's going on. At the end of that process then, when she's got it to the right balance of sugar and starch, she'd haul the grain upstairs, and the men are up there. They'd take the grain off her through a trapdoor up there, and then spread it over an iron mesh floor which is suspended above the bottom of the oast house where they roasted the malt. Sensitivity to temperature changes is not something that's fits in the portfolio of males, basically. So that sort of process lends itself to the sort of sensitivity, I think, that physically women have. That's one of the reasons why it's a woman's job, I think. Australia's oldest surviving brewery. There's nothing else like it in Australia anywhere. Nothing intact like it either.